Here we are. In our discussions on the 1950s today, aspects of the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, and space race. We have McCarthyism, the Korean War, Browners Board of Education, the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr., the Interstate Highway Act, Sputnik, NASA, the 1960 election of John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and the New Frontier. Okay, let's dive in. Now, there are certain types of people in this world you'll meet who are just basically just all about themselves. Care nothing about anyone else, will do nothing for anyone else. Basically the type that when they finally pass from this world, you're glad they're gone, or don't care they're gone. Like I said, there are a few people like that around, not a lot, but those kind of people basically destroy whatever lives are in their way of whatever petty goal they might have. That's Joe McCarthy. And you give somebody like that real power, the damage they can do is incalculable. U.S. Senator from Wisconsin. So it introduces a new word into our cultural vocabulary, McCarthyism, which is to accuse someone without proof, or to insinuate without proof that there's something wrong with them, something bad about them. Now McCarthy, he had replaced Robert Follett Jr. in the U.S. Senate, Wisconsin, and he was the son of the progressive governor and senator, so fairly liberal himself. Actually, he'd been a tail gunner during World War II. He was a judge in Wisconsin for a while, but started there as spotty, disastrous. He was an alcoholic, chronic gambler. There are a lot of stories as a judge. He was granting couples quickie divorces for something under the table. And also a lot of stories that whispers in Washington circles that he wasn't the type of man you should leave little kids around. But he's a United States Senator. People actually voted for him, elected him. And in 1950, he's rated as the worst in the Senate. He's facing re-election in 1952. And so he's going to try to use the communism issue to propel his political fortunes. So in February 1950, made a speech for a Republican women's group in Wheeling, West Virginia, which held a piece of paper and said, "In my hand I have a list of 250 known communists working for the State Department." They admitted privately to friends later that this piece of paper he held up was just simply an old laundry list. Didn't have any names on it, just making something up. The statement made a little stir at first, but he kept repeating his statements, steadily drawing national attention. The day after the Wheeling speech, he gave a similar speech. It said the number was 57, 81, 105, changing the number from week to week, speech to speech. But the charge of communism in the State Department hit the right nerve at the right time. The nation already rattled by the rise of communism in Eastern Europe, China, the Soviet A-bomb, charge of subversion at home. Now here's this guy no one had ever heard of, guy's friend, people in the Senate didn't really like, saying they're communists in the State Department. Now the thing is, this whole thing, he never had a shred of proof to back anything up. Now, a friend of McCarthy's, the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, used the FBI to back up McCarthy in providing him background information on people he's accusing. But Hoover cautioned McCarthy never to name specific numbers, advice that McCarthy ignored. See, Hoover had been head of the FBI since its creation in the 1920s. That's a man who basically used a lot of blackmail to try to keep himself in power, keeping tabs and files on politicians, celebrities, just basically spending most of his time spying on potential political opponents rather than actually doing his job. That way he's able to stay in power. Had tons and tons of files on different people when he died in 1972. But people called for Senate and House committees were badgered about supposed communist links to no matter how flimsy. They come for McCarthy's committee. Basically, he red beats. Just sits there and just browbeats them for a couple of hours, barely giving him a chance to respond. Leveling just baseless charges and innuendos. Well, your third cousin twice removed once read this newspaper. You got to be a communist too. So bizarre things like that. The thing is, though, in this atmosphere, any scintilla of evidence, or even just being called before one of these committees, could ruin men and women. So they'd be fired and publicly humiliated. What they call blackballing occurring is that people were fired from jobs and kept out of particular industries for the rest of their lives just for the fact that they were called before one of these committees. So they didn't do anything. No evidence they were doing anything. But they're fired and kept out of these jobs the rest of their lives. Lives basically ruined. A lot of Hollywood actors and directors are also blackballed, never able to find work again, only on the flimsy evidence that they may have once attended a meeting of the Communist Party or had a friend or relative who had been a communist. Author of the famous novel, the famous movie The Maltese Falcon, a man named Dashiell Hammett, blacklisted after being accused of being a communist. And no evidence. But McCarthy himself will bluff his way through hearings, leveling baseless charges, never giving witnesses a chance to react. So McCarthyism came to describe not just McCarthy's antics, but other red-baiting episodes that took place in the 1950s. For example, the Red Scare forced the Cincinnati Reds baseball team to change their name to Redlegs, because red was a nickname for communists. 1953, a group of Houston Republican women charged that the new superintendent for the Houston Independent School District, a man named George Eby, was a communist. Well, the Houston School Board investigated, but they found out that Eby was not a communist, but he belonged to a group that favored civil rights, world peace, and desegregation. So in late summer 1953, the Houston School Board produced a report stating that while Eby was not a communist, he was simply too radical for the school district because he favored civil rights, desegregation, and world peace. Now, McCarthy was developing a steady national following, but he only registered a 50% approval rating in the Gallup poll in early 1954. He easily won re-election in 1952, but his attacks ruined countless lives, and in 1954, famed reporter Edward R. Murrow decided to do an investigation of him. And very famous series exchanges on TV. Murrow won a lot of fame in World War II by reporting on the German bombings of London live on CBS Radio. They had a TV program called See It Now. So there's a movie made about this a few years ago called Good Night, Good Luck. It's a track fight between Murrow and McCarthy. Actually, the title of the movie came from something that Murrow would say after the end of every broadcast, good night and good luck. But Murrow decided to investigate a couple of particular people that McCarthy is accusing of being communists, including a couple of Air Force enlisted men, a couple of private citizens, on national television saying there's absolutely no evidence these men are communists or subversives or unpatriotic in any way, shape, or form. That McCarthy is destroying these people's lives without evidence. They go back and forth. CBS eventually gets to the point they give McCarthy free airtime to try to refute Murrow's claims. Instead, McCarthy just launches into an attack on Murrow and CBS News. And McCarthy is very quickly overreaching himself. In 1954, a picture of him in your book here on page 950. In 1954, charged the Army was harboring communists. And so TV networks broadcast what came to be called the Army McCarthy hearings. It's among the earliest of the televised Senate hearings. So people are able to see right up close for themselves as what's happening. Just remember, TV cameras in the Senate and Congress just weren't done yet. Not a lot of people had TV sets yet. Now, 1954, U.S. senators accusing the Army of harboring communists. That was big news, so they're televising it. So instead of reading it in the papers or just hearing brief snippets on the news about what's happening here, people are able to start seeing what's happening for themselves. McCarthy going in and is basically leveling baseless charges, no evidence, browbeating, trying to destroy people without any evidence. Actually, you see lawyers condemning McCarthy's tactics on TV, and the book sees for itself that this is just a disgraceful display by a United States Senator. Well, Hoover backed away from McCarthy after this. In December 1954, the Senate censured McCarthy for his actions. So his conduct unbecoming of a United States Senator. So the age of Joe McCarthy is over, but for all of his bluster and all of his charges of communist infiltration, he never uncovered one communist. Not one person he refused was guilty. McCarthy died in 1957. He drank himself to death. Now we got the Korean War. Now, at the end of World War II, the Korean Peninsula is divided into two halves at the 38th parallel. We got communist North Korea and non-communist South Korea. I got page 946 in the book. It's the map of Korea and the Korean War. Now, the Cold War in Asia, it's a lot different from the Cold War in Europe. Like I say, in Europe you had pre-elected governments being overthrown, clearly established civil rights in law being subverted to a police state. But in Asia, basically, you don't have a lot of democracy yet. Basically, you have communists and anti-communists. See, South Korea is, North Korea is communist, South Korea is basically a police state itself. It really doesn't become a democracy until the 1970s. So that was following that after a series of demonstrations and riots. But this is the thing that the Cold War did. It neatly bisected the world. One half communist, one half anti-communist. Basically, every foreign policy decision fell on that question. Are they communists? Are they backing the communists or not? Are they fighting? Are they anti-communist democracies? Somebody fighting the communists. And the U.S. would support anybody who claimed they're trying to suppress communism. There could be rebel groups in their country, basically using it to finance a civil war, whether they were in the government or not. It could be used to prop up dictatorships, or even let's help struggling democracies. Contrarily, the Soviets would back up with the same thing: money, weapons, materiel. Any country or any faction that said that they were supporting communism, or they were trying to subvert colonialism or the United States. It's either one or the other. So as a result of this, the United States trying to contain communism and trying to fight communism around the world, they end up being in the position of supporting a lot of very unsavory characters. South Korea was, at this point, still a dictatorship. Ex-Soviet will become a democracy. Then we have a problem in Vietnam in the 1960s, 1970s. North Vietnam was a communist country, but South Vietnam was really basically a dictatorship itself. The United States having to back a dictatorship. Let's look at these countries a little more closely. So North Korea is controlled by a communist strongman, Kim Il-sung. In Korea, the last name's actually the first name's actually a family name. Kim family has been controlling Korea since the end of World War II. It's his grandson that's in control of North Korea today. And in 1950, North Korea is actually considered to be the more industrialized area. South Korea, controlled by anti-communist strongman named Syngman Rhee. It's more agricultural. Today, economically, it's pretty much the opposite. North Korea's most of its energy goes into agriculture, but it has its population is half starved. But South Korea is an advanced industrial country with a very high standard of living. After the 1990s, there was a horrible famine in North Korea that killed millions of people. Because basically their government just sat back and let them all starve to death. Well, after World War II, the U.S. has been slowly diminishing its military presence in the Far East. In 1950, a State Department official made an offhand remark that the U.S. considered Korea to be outside its defense perimeter. So encouraged by these developments, North Korea plotted to attack the South. It was suspected, but not generally known at the time, the Soviets were helping plan and encouraging the North to attack and drive the Western influence out of Korea. The Soviets were giving them weapons, giving them advice on how to attack South Korea. On June 25, 1950, the North struck. President Truman saw it as a clear case of Soviet aggression and went to the UN Security Resolution condemning North Korea as an aggressor and calling on the member nations to participate in freeing South Korea. 18 nations participated, and it was an overwhelmingly American affair. Now, the UN is able to pass this resolution, but basically because the Soviets were boycotting the UN at the time. So within a few days, U.S. troops stationed in Japan were fighting the North Koreans, but very, very badly outnumbered. Most Americans polled this time believe it's the beginning of World War III, but by August, as you can see here in 1946, the U.S. had stopped the advance in a small pocket in the southeastern corner of South Korea called Pusan, called Port City, and called it the Pusan Perimeter. So by September, General Douglas MacArthur, who's the commander of American forces in Korea, stages a daring counterattack by going deep behind the front lines and attacking at Incheon, this little port just outside of Seoul on the Yellow Sea. So playing on the delicate timing of the tides, MacArthur staged a daring amphibious assault which captured Incheon and the capital Seoul very quickly. The North was quickly pushed back across the border, and the U.S. pursued. Well, Truman, now encouraged by MacArthur and Secretary of State Dean Acheson, now pushed for the reunification of a democratic Korea. U.S. forces chased North Korea north to the Yalu River, which is the border with China. Then disaster struck. The Chinese communists had warned the U.S. not to approach the border, but the U.S. pressed on. In November, China invaded Korea. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops pour across the border. U.S. forces are routed. MacArthur now pressed for a full-scale war with China, probably criticizing Truman for limiting his options. MacArthur went so far as to state that the U.S. should use nuclear weapons against China's positions in Manchuria. Well, furious at McCarthy's disrespect of his authority and his criticisms, Truman relieved MacArthur of command in April 1951. MacArthur was relieved because he failed to realize that there's a civilian control of the military. Even a general has to follow the orders of the president. The president says, don't say something or do one thing or do the other. They have to do it. And MacArthur saying we should use nuclear weapons publicly, criticizing his superior, President Truman, he was undermining the U.S.'s military and diplomatic position. MacArthur went so far as to suggest that the North Koreans and the Chinese should come to him personally and negotiate. Instead of saying, come to the United States, the UN, or President Truman. So Truman had enough of him and fired him. Truman administration pointed out that not only would a war with China prove drawn out and disastrous, it would leave Europe open to Soviet attack, and the U.S. would have to pull its forces from Europe to China and Korea to fight the Chinese. Well, MacArthur returned home to hear his welcome, but simply faded away after that. The war in Korea afterward bogged down into stalemate, finally ending with an armistice on July 27, 1953. Basically just a ceasefire. No formal peace settlement was ever reached, just basically to have the ceasefire in place. Two Koreas are technically in a state of war, but the North sometimes sending out propaganda and threatening the South, but so the North is really just a shadow. It's more of a nuisance than anything else. But the border between the two Koreas is now the most heavily fortified in the world. During this war, North Korea and China lost more than 1.5 million people. The U.S. lost 33,000 men in combat. It's basically stalemate. Except Now, the Korean War, years afterward, came to be known as the Forgotten War. So the United States, like I said, the war was largely kind of forgotten between the euphoria of World War II and the disaster of Vietnam. Like I say, probably the most popular depiction of the Korean War in media is the old TV show and the old movie MASH. Like I said, it's based on a book written by an army doctor in Korea, but coming out in the 1970s, it was basically more of a criticism of the Vietnam War in general. So I get to 1952. The 22nd Amendment, now ratified in 1951, now prohibited any president from seeking a third term. Truman had bitterly opposed this amendment as a slap in the face to Franklin Roosevelt. While Truman was exempt from the amendment, he was now past 70, dogged by the war in Korea, charges of corruption and subversion of his administration. Retired, he decided not to seek a re-election. So he threw his support to Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson was actually the grandson of Grover Cleveland's vice president. She had the same name. Stevenson, very thoughtful man, considered to be an intellectual. Attracted a wide following people new to politics, but wasn't very well known outside of Illinois. And to add that, he inherited the criticisms of the Truman administration. Well, the Republican National Convention that year was acrimonious as a divided convention. Thomas E. Dewey, the Republican nominee in 1944 and 48, was briefly considered. Ohio Senator Robert Taft, author of the Taft-Hartley Anti-Union Act, is also a leading contender, but the nomination eventually went to war hero, retired General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Actually, Eisenhower chosen for president, and California Senator Richard Nixon chosen for vice president. The problem for Nixon was he developed problems very early. Rumors erupted that he'd been on the take, heralding his future as vice president, and Nixon took to TV to defend himself. Can be called an episode called The Checkers Speech. Basically, paid for airtime on the networks, defending his reputation, disputing the charges he was of corruption. But at the end of the speech, he said, well, we did accept one gift. As Porter gave our two little girls a dog, kids like any dog, love the dog, they named it Checkers, and he said, I don't care what anybody else says, we like the dog, we're going to keep him. Like I say, telegrams from supporters flooded the Republican headquarters, urging Eisenhower to keep Nixon on the ticket. Say Nixon's display pretty much saved his career at this point. Now, as for Eisenhower, as a political novice, he'd never run for any office before. He had a very wildly popular following. He was the guy who helped win World War II. He's a genial, grandfatherly man. He's kind of vague in his promises, simply promised to clean up what he called this mess in Washington. His nickname, going all the way back to his days at West Point, was Ike, so the slogan was quite simply, I like Ike. Stevenson had trouble competing against such a popular figure as Eisenhower, especially when Truman was so deeply popular at the end of his administration. Well, Eisenhower ends up winning by 7 million votes, winning 5 states in the South, including Texas and Oklahoma. Gets 55.1% of the vote, 442 electoral votes. Stevenson gets 44.4%, 89 electoral votes. You can see the results here on page 978. And with this election, the South seemed to be slowly turning into a two-party region. Interesting side note here. When Truman became president in 1945, he had no vice president. Actually, there was no provision for providing a vice president at that point. The president died or resigned. The vice president suddenly became president. Or if the vice president died or resigned from office, the office simply stayed vacant. So in 1948, when Truman was elected, he had his vice president was Alben Barkley. Barkley was the junior senator, was a senator from Kentucky. Actually, very popular in Kentucky, had a very respected man in the Senate. And the thing about the U.S. Senate is it's built on seniority. Like say, what jobs, what positions in the Senate is based on who's been there the longest. Well, in 1954, Barkley is re-elected to the U.S. Senate. He goes back to his old job, but now is the junior senator for Kentucky, and Barkley, like say, he's lost all that seniority that's been years building up. Basically, he's the bottom of the rung now. Well, in 1956, Barkley is giving a speech at Washington and Lee University when a student asked him about this reversal, that gone from being this very powerful U.S. senator to vice president, now just basically low man on the totem pole. Barkley, receiving this question, responded, "I'd rather be a servant in the house of the Lord than sit in the seats of the mighty." I'd rather be a servant in the house of the Lord than sit in the seats of the mighty. And at that, he dropped dead of a heart attack on the spot. Now, that's an exit line. Now, we talk about the 1950s. It's a very strange decade. Like say you have a new affluence for many in the United States. A lot of consumer products are available. Many Americans going on a spending spree, freed from the constraints of World War II and the Great Depression. But it's also a time of unrest and civil rights. It's also marked by intense conformity, a dread of communism, and a dread of nuclear annihilation. In fact, this is something they actually would do in schools, is they conduct nuclear bomb drills. What to do in case a nuclear bomb exploded in your city, in your school. And they show the students these films saying, just duck and cover. If there's a nuclear attack, just get under your desk. Like somehow this wooden plastic table or desk here has the force to withstand a nuclear blast. Actually told students to actually have nuclear bomb drills. Well, after the war, and thousands of veterans returning home, and through the GI Bill of Rights signed by President Roosevelt in 1944, they went to college by the truckloads. Many colleges couldn't handle the load. College enrollment went from 1.5 million in 1940 to 3.6 million by 1960, thanks in part to the GI Bill. Veterans had new families, went looking for affordable housing in the suburbs, away from the cities, later getting what they called suburbanization. In 1948, a man named William Levitt opened a housing development on a former potato farm in Long Island, New York, 30 miles from Manhattan, which really kind of exemplified this move towards suburbanization. Levitt had made a bunch of money in World War II developing prefabricated housing for Navy families, basically learning how to build houses very quickly using similar designs and very few materials. And so he decides to apply that to the private sector after the war. So opens 4,000 housing units in less than a year in this little area that can be called Levittown. And he's able to sell these houses very quickly thanks to new government financing regulations and through the GI Bill. And the original homes were about 720 square feet, very small, very modest. Sold for less than $7,000 on easy monthly terms. By 1951, 17,000 homes had been built and occupied Levittown. It became a model for housing developments. Suburbs grew by 46% in the 1950s. Of course, that growth came at the expense of the larger cities. Big cities remained stagnant population, even dropping some. Like I say, this new generation of young home buyers, they're also tending to have much larger families than they had in the 1930s. It's getting what they call the baby boom generation. Just all of a sudden, all those GIs coming home, getting married, having a bunch of kids. And by the early 1950s, they're having a serious problem because so many kids coming to school, the schools weren't expecting it. They didn't have room for all these kids in all these schools. They had to start building new schools very rapidly. And so it's been a demographic problem for years in the United States. Once kids get old enough to start going to college, they have to build new colleges and rapidly expand the existing ones. So, try to make sure there's enough room for them in the workforce. In the 1970s, they had mandatory retirement ages for a lot of corporations. It says when you're 65, you had to retire, no choice. Now it's kind of causing a problem because that entire generation is getting ready to retire, and they didn't have as many kids as their parents had. So we're talking about the potential problems for Social Security financing. But during the decade, you have a 19% increase in population, and largely because of the baby boom. America's love affair with the car continued. In 1956, Eisenhower signed into law the Interstate Highway Act. It created the modern interstate highway system. Now, it's slightly different from the U.S. highway system, which in this case the federal government would pay for 90% of these highways. States would pick up 10% of the cost. It's initially slated to be a 42,500-mile highway system connecting the largest cities in the United States. It's a limited access highway system. All interstate highways, you can only get on or off them by an exit. It's not like the U.S. highway system where sometimes it's intersections, stoplights and stop signs, and sometimes not. It's all limited access. Each interstate highway had 12-foot lanes, minimum 4-lane divided highways. Interestingly enough, the interstate highway system is designed with the defense purpose in mind. Every so often there would be these 1-mile-long straightaways designed as emergency landing strips. And it's also designed to transport troops and tanks to the largest cities in case the United States were ever attacked. But it's most widely successful in the private sector as commerce and theaters had safe, easy access roads to go from point to point. Now, let's say 1950, the U.S. bought 6 million cars. Of course, Interstate Highway Act is helping make sure that people have a place to drive. Now, probably one of the most defining cultural marks of the 1950s, the development of television. Television was actually invented in the 1920s, but it's still very experimental for a long time because you have a lot more setup and equipment to produce, broadcast, and receive TV signals than you would with the radio. So it really didn't become affordable and practical until after the war. It's got the largest cities on the coast first, 1946, 47, 48, developing TV stations, but by the 1950s, TV started to really become very popular. America falling in love with it. It completely changed America's social habits in a very short time. The whole nation would gather and watch programs of one of the three networks existed at that time, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Basically, you had just 3 TV stations in most areas, sometimes only 2. Since everybody's watching the same things, that's what they do the next day they're at work or at school. They talk about what they saw on TV, go in previous conversations and activities. In fact, cities noticed one very curious phenomenon. Was at certain times during the evening, a lot of cities reported sudden drops in water pressure. They couldn't figure that out. They realized what was happening. Commercial breaks. People going up, going to the bathroom during commercials, all at the same time. Now, by 1960, 25% of all American homes have TV sets. As early as 1951, broadcasters were experimenting with color TV programs, but technology was still too primitive and too expensive to be practical and didn't become readily available until the mid-1960s. Like I say, 1962-63 started having some programs in color, but it's mostly because one of the major networks, NBC, was owned by RCA, which was a major producer of color TV sets. So they wanted to have color broadcasting so they could sell a new line of products. So by 1964, pretty much all primetime broadcasts that were in color. Air conditioning was also began to be perfected to be made more affordable. Houses to be cooled to a cool temperature in the hottest days of summer with little fuss and at a reasonable cost. Now, before air conditioning, people in the South had to sleep in summer times on screened-in porches or sleep outside as human nighttime temperature still hovered in the 80s. You just can't sleep inside without air conditioning, still being that hot outside. In fact, you notice some of these older homes here, some of these older neighborhoods here, why they have such large porches, a lot of them screened in. There's time for people to sleep on them in the summertime. But now, with air conditioning, rapidly added many homes coming up, almost standard new homes, people could sleep indoors during the summer, and the South became more attractive to people in the North. Summers would be more bearable now, and coupled with fairly mild winters, made the South seem much more ideal. So as a result, in the 1950s, more and more people started moving to the South, especially as defense factories and other industries started moving to the South. So the nation now had a new affluence that erased most memories of the Depression. The nation had money, went on a spending spree, fueled by TV advertisers. Now, by 1950, so the gross national product of the United States had reached $318 billion. That's the total value of all goods and services in the United States was $318 billion. That's 50% higher than it had been in 1940. And what starts also happening is the civil rights movement started to take shape. Now, African Americans began to make gains in the 1940s as the military was desegregated and the court struck down what they called the white primaries. There's several states that passed laws saying that since political parties are private organizations, they could make the rules for who was eligible to vote in their elections. And so a lot of these political parties, especially in the South, said that only whites could vote in their elections. The Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional since this is a part of the political process. Actually, in a lot of southern states, there's still one-party states. It basically meant minorities couldn't vote at all, because the primary is basically where the election was decided. And also efforts at desegregation. So we go to this case, Brown v. Board of Education. Remember, when writing a court case is always underlined or italicized. Now, for years, the NAACP legal branch led by Charles Houston and Thurgood Marshall have been working to undermine Jim Crow laws by building a body of law through a series of court rulings that chipped away at the separate but equal rulings and the law set forth by the Plessy v. Ferguson case. What you have to understand is law works on precedent, previous decisions made previously. And the NAACP realized they couldn't convince state legislatures to overturn these Jim Crow laws. So what did Houston and Marshall do? They went to court. And this is actually the genius of this. Marshall basically took the Jim Crow system that was being thrown at him and turned it on its ear. He beat the system, beat the white supremacists with their own rules. Now, slowly, up before Brown, the NAACP is meeting a lot of success. 1947, for example, Jackie Robinson became the first African American to play baseball since the 1980s when he was signed for the Brooklyn Dodgers. What happened was in the 1880s, white players began refusing to play baseball with blacks, and so African Americans are slowly rooted out of the game. Also, you have other cases here, like, for example, in 1946, you have a woman named Ada Sipewell. Ada Sipewell is an African-American woman. She sued for admission at the University of Oklahoma Law School. The University of Oklahoma Law School is for whites only. The thing is, Oklahoma practiced white supremacy, and so OU Law School is for whites only. And they refused to provide any kind of separate facility for her. So they weren't going to open up a law school just for her. Well, the Supreme Court says the university had to provide facilities for her, but she refused to send, basically telling Oklahoma, set up a separate law school for her then. She can't go to the regular one. Oklahoma grudgingly complies, but Sipewell says, no, I'm not going to this separate law school. I'm going to go to the regular law school. So they go back to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, admit her to the regular law school. So by 1949, she's enrolled and she's admitted. 1950, you have a similar case. University of Texas Law School. African-American gentleman named Heman Sweat. UT Law School, also for whites only. The NAACP Case goes on to Supreme Court. Supreme Court rules Sweat must be admitted into the law school. So UT decided it's going to set up separate facilities just for this one man. Is a room in the janitor's closet. Exactly. So Sweat went back to Supreme Court. Sweat had argued, as Scipio had, that the law school experience was very different from any regular type of education. That unless he's admitted into the regular law school, he cannot receive an equal education with whites. He'd lack access to regular law school's law professors, law library, and interaction with other students and alumni. The Supreme Court agreed that this was an unequal arrangement, and that Sweat deserved to be admitted into the regular law school. Unfortunately for Sweat, he is dogged by hate mail and death threats every day from the day this case was announced to the day this decision was made. So it was just too much on him, and eventually dropped out of law school. It's sometimes the situation of some of these first figures in this case, it takes everything they have just to open the door, but they don't have the strength left to walk through. So what the NAACP is doing here is they're using a top-down approach instead of from a bottom-up approach. Because at higher levels of education, the education experience is a lot different. Especially here in graduate schools, medical schools, law schools. Let's think about it. Who are the professors at these graduate schools, these medical schools, law schools? A lot of states, these are the top minds in those fields. Like say some of the best lawyers in that state are professors in the law school. The best doctors and the best medical minds and scientists in that state are usually professors at the medical school. So you simply just cannot replicate everything brick by brick into a separate building and say it's the same thing, because it's not a system that can be replicated brick by brick. It's people that make it up. It's the experience that makes it up. You see, you could not clone these professors, put them in a separate classroom and say, okay, you have your separate law school now, your separate medical school. Couldn't be done. It'd be ridiculous to even try. Wouldn't have access to the same facilities. And plus the fact, who are the students you're working with? Except that level of education, except there's a lot of interaction between students, not just in class, but after class and after graduation. Example, you're a lawyer just graduated from law school. You're looking for a job. A lot of cases you're able to get that first job at a big law firm because the guy's head of the law firm just happens to have gone to that same law school. So, oh, you know so-and-so. You went to so-and-so. You must have taken Professor such-and-such. Yeah, I loved him. He's great. So I like him too. Why don't you come on and work for me? Or you're a lawyer practicing a case before court. The judge just happens to have been your best friend in law school. Hey, that works out well for you. Or what happens in a lot of cases, a lawyer or a doctor, they have having a troubling case and need advice on it. So what do? Call their friends from medical school or law school. They'll figure out the problem. If you didn't have that same type of educational experience, you wouldn't have had those resources to draw on. So no matter how much they would have tried the physical building and the infrastructure, they could not have replicated the experience. So therefore, the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, separate but equal, could not possibly work. It could not be separate and be equal. The only way it would work is you had to combine, you had to integrate. You had to say to each man, woman, and child in that state, everyone is equal to everyone else, no matter what they look like. No matter what church they go to, what country they're from, they are all equal in the eyes of the law. Because if you don't, then democracy is just a joke. Then you might as well say the United States of America is not a free country. Because freedom, the justice, the law has to work for everybody. Otherwise, it doesn't work at all. So, Sipul, Sweatt, and other cases, the NAACP pushes forward with its next target, public schools. That you cannot have separate but equal at these higher levels of education. How can you possibly have it at the lower levels of education? So, Random Works of Education case arose in Topeka, Kansas. You wouldn't think of Kansas as being a southern state, but they did practice segregation too. In this case, a little girl named Linda Brown. It says she lived in Topeka. Parents middle class, good, decent, hard-working people. Also members of the local NAACP. Because of the city's segregation statutes, Linda Brown could not go to the white school. It was just a couple blocks from her house. So she literally couldn't see it from her house. Instead, she had to go to the black school clear across town. So her parents, the local NAACP, sued. So Marshall takes the case and combines this with several, and the Supreme Court combines this with several other cases. Cases from Delaware and other cases NAACP is working on. So Marshall makes his case for the Supreme Court in 1954. Marshall argued before the Supreme Court that separate but equal, even in substantially equal settings, did profound psychological damage to minority children and thus violated the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. So the Supreme Court, in the end ruling, agreed that separate but equal is inherently unequal. Next, Chief Justice, this man on page 982, Earl Warren. 9-0, segregation is unconstitutional. But Chief Justice Warren realized it would be difficult to change historic patterns of segregation quickly and asked for an unprecedented second hearing in 1955, asking the affected states, as Attorney Generals come forward, and discuss with the court what kind of problems they would have to desegregation. Well, his Attorney General stepped forward and said, basically giving every reason in the world why they shouldn't do it, but none of them saying how they're actually intending to comply with the order. So in 1955, Warren issues a second ruling, again 9-0, saying all school districts need to desegregate, in his words, with all deliberate speed, with any kind of delay, as quickly as possible. Now, already a couple of school districts had desegregated. First one actually was here in Arkansas, a little district called Charleston, just outside of Fort Smith. The head of the school board came to their local lawyer, man named Dale Bumpers, and said, what does this ruling mean? He said, I guess it means we better desegregate. Charleston became the first school district in the South to desegregate. Dale Bumpers is later governor of the state, the U.S. Senator. The next one to segregate was Fayetteville, just a few weeks after that. Now, because of the Brown ruling, Jim Crow was dismantled, but it leads to a wave of racial violence and confrontation throughout the South. Eisenhower is unsettled by the sweeping ruling, believed that racial attitudes can only be changed slowly instead of hasty lawmaking. Eisenhower had been quietly working to try to desegregate veterans hospitals in the Washington, D.C. school system and other facilities, but remained quiet on the ruling. So instead of stepping forward and defending the ruling and asking people to follow what was now the law of the land, he said nothing. So Southern governors and politicians took Eisenhower's silence as a sign that he supported segregation. Like saying the situation just grew out of control. Across the South, you had signs cropping up saying, "Impeach Earl Warren." Of course, no such thing was going to happen, but this is foreshadowing of the racial violence was about to happen. We get to the election in 1956. Next gets a replay of 1952. Stevenson against Eisenhower. Now, Stevenson had called for an international test ban treaty testing the hydrogen bomb, which is a new form of more powerful form of the atomic bomb. And also called for ending the draft, as peacetime draft still in the 1950s, and calling for an all-volunteer army. But military questions, though, put Stevenson at considerable disadvantage to the very popular war hero Eisenhower. At the Democratic Convention, the most interesting point of contention was for Vice President as Stevenson threw open the question to the delegates of the convention. Contenders included Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy, who had become president in 1960, and Tennessee Senator Albert Ford Sr., the father of the former vice president. Delegates instead chose Kentucky Senator Estes Kefauver, who won a claim for his work against organized crime. So Eisenhower winds up winning fairly easily, 57.6%, 457 electoral votes, to 42% for Stevenson. 73 electoral votes. Well, a lot of Eisenhower's second term be faced with questions of civil rights and foreign policy. So we'll finish up on that next time. So read chapters 33 and 34 in your book. Let's see how